I think China is extremely worried that they get blamed for this, right? Because it's wreaking havoc across the world, both, physically and economically. And so for them to see this doubts and disinformation that maybe the US did it's a way for them to, one, undercut the US position in certain countries, but two, create enough doubt and enough sort of noise that maybe they avoid what I think will be inevitable calls for accountability. I think you're going to start hearing more people say, well, what are the Chinese actually also pushing back so hard because they're trying to hide something? And so it's creating, and I have heard that from not Americans. So I think it's blowing up, it's backfiring on China in many countries, I think, not just in the US. And it's just unfortunate because the world doesn't need this right now. The world needs to figure out how to fight this virus.
China? What are they even saying? My chance new go watch made in China.
Hello and welcome to China Talk, now posted on Lawfare. This week's guest is Bill Bishop, the author of the leading English language newsletter on China, Sinocism. What have the past 3 months taught us most about the CCP in China?
Well, Jordan, first of all, thanks for having me, and congratulations on becoming published by Lawfare. I think it's a great site, great network. What are the last 3 months have taught us about the CCP? I assume that's the entire podcast, right? Because sounds like an easy question. Actually, there's a lot there. I mean, I think that we've seen the gamut from the predilection to secrecy, to covering things up, to bad news not flowing up through their system, to once the senior leadership decides they want to act, I think in quite remarkable and efficient, brutally efficient, I think you could say, response where they can really mobilize all of society to tackle what they see as, frankly, an existential threat on many levels. And that certainly, I think, is what the COVID-19 has been to China and now obviously to the world.
So were any parts of this response surprising to you on the upside or downside, or did everything really sort of line up with the general predilections of Xi-era China?
So I think what was surprising was how they screwed up the initial response to the virus, because they had said, and I think it was the head of the CDC, I think it was Gulfu, who had said last year, basically, was it last year or maybe it was at the 18th Party Congress, that SARS couldn't happen again because we built systems to catch something like that early, and how whatever systems they believed they built had completely failed, and how they didn't learn any of the lessons of SARS in terms of how you don't cover up, you don't lie about it. And so that, I think, was, on the one hand, I guess we shouldn't be surprised given the nature of the system. On the other hand, the one thing about the Communist Party is it has shown an ability to learn and adapt. And in this case, that basically they seem to have unlearned or ignored those lessons from SARS at tremendous cost to China and to the rest of the world.
So, it's fascinating because it's like, okay, we have these two contrasting themes about like the essence of the CCP, right? Where on the one hand, it has been able to evolve dramatically over the past 50 years. But at the same time, what it ended up running into are the sort of most central contradictions, like the local central relations, sharing of information. And even though there have been a number of really obvious, very big deal pandemics, which the US has the excuse of not having had to live through over the past 20 years, it still wasn't able to get the information flow in place. And you still end up seeing Li Weiliang getting censored for trying to spread the word.
And I mean, the reality is I guess in some ways it really shouldn't have been a surprise too, because of what happened with the African swine fever, right? Which
Totally.
has turned out to be in many ways a man-made disaster in China that became that man-made disaster because of many policy mistakes and issues within the system in terms of people, all sorts of misincentives to hide information and to continue raising diseased hogs or sell them to slaughterhouses. So I think the point really is that on the one hand, the party says things have evolved, but on the other hand, actually, that we shouldn't be really that surprised. It's just unfortunate, and I think inside the system there was some surprise, because again, you had officials who seemed to really believe that they'd figured out how to avoid the next SARS. In terms of the other bits, sort of how things played out, I mean, I think when it really started getting ugly in late January, and basically they had a lockdown in Wuhan. They had that unprecedented Chinese New Year, Lunar New Year's Day. They had the standing committee meeting, which then they actually broadcast video from inside the meeting, which I think I don't, and I can't find anyone who ever remembers seeing actual video of on CCTV from inside a Politburo Standing Committee meeting. And so that was he put out a directive a few days before that, but on January 25th with that Standing Committee meeting, that was okay, this is obviously a crisis. We are, this is people's war. We are turning the entire system to fight this. And there was a lot of commentary, Chernobyl moment, this is going to weaken Xi, blah, blah, blah. Xi had disappeared for a few days. And so there was various speculation about, is Xi in trouble? Was there, pressure? Was there a coup? All sorts of wacky stuff that happens whenever there appear to be problems in China and Xi isn't, that you don't see him. And I will say in my newsletter, I was pretty clear that I thought those were BS. But, what it turned out, though, is I think now, fast forward, it looks like that at least now Xi in many ways looks like he was able to leverage this into, sort of more of he's the commander of the people's war against the virus. And so certainly China, we got the news today that Wuhan was going to relax a lot of the lockdown measures over the next couple of weeks. Mm-hmm. You're starting to see schools reopen across the country. You're starting to see that, really the sense that things are sort of, coming back to something approximating or approaching normalcy. Meanwhile, the rest of the world is going to hell in a handbasket. And so yeah. I think that going to hell in a handbasket has two sides of it. On the one hand, from the Communist Party's perspective, hey, look, we figured it out. We took it seriously. We got through this, right? Look at Italy, look at Spain, look at New York, look at the US, on and on and on. The other hand, though, is the problem for the Communist Party and the Chinese economy, which is that they need the global economy to be functioning to actually have an economic recovery of any meaningful nature. And so they can't spend too much time hoping that the rest of the world goes to hell in a handbasket, and as a nice sort of juxtaposition or contrast to how China has done so well dealing with the virus, because they need those markets, they need that investment. And so right now, I think a month ago or 3 weeks ago, it looked like China was coming out of it really well. Now, though, I think there's another layer of risk around the economic side because of what's going on in the rest of the world.
Yeah. Staying with the leadership dynamics before we turn to the economics, it's just been fascinating watching the Trump psychology sort of flipping from the I'm leading a people's war to no, like the economic turndown is too scary, so now we're going to just start the country again in 2 weeks. Just for the record, we're recording this on March 24th. I don't know if you have a U.S. policy response versus China policy response and like what that tells us about the two systems or whatnot, Riff.
I think it goes back to how I think China really mishandled the initial response and allowed it to become a much bigger problem than it should have been. But once they decided that it was a serious issue, they really did take it quite seriously and responded much better than the U.S. has so far when it comes to things like the testing, when it comes to things like figuring out how to, and we may get there in places like New York faster than, fairly quickly, where they realized in Wuhan, for example, that they needed to take everybody who was sick or tested positive, even if they didn't have, even if they weren't really sick, they needed to put them in these central quarantine facilities. Because having, keeping people at home in their small apartments, one person gets sick, the whole family gets sick, it turned out to actually lead to a lot of deaths. And so I think that, but I do also think, the PRC system does seem to have more of a belief in science than certain parts of the U.S. system, or certain parts of the U.S. political system, I should say, not necessarily the government. They also have a much larger arsenal of brutal and efficient methods they can bring to bear to get people to comply when they decide they're going to shut down the city, or they're going to decide that people can't leave their homes. And so, that
there were no videos I saw of the equivalent of Miami spring breakers just trying to live their best lives on Chinese social media.
And I certainly don't want to get into like, the sort of China did it better, or we'll see, because we're still getting started here. But I think that the PRC system, the CCP system, it just has a toolkit that most countries, and certainly the Western democracies, don't have, or really aren't willing to use unless it's an absolute, even a much larger disaster. I think, sure. the issue on the leadership dynamics too is really where we come out in terms of like on Xi, the question, and you see, I think inside China is how does the party and how does she make sort of push the blame on to the provincial Hubei officials and the local Wuhan officials in ways that don't blow back against Xi personally. But at the same time, if they push too hard that it was the local guys really screwed up and therefore it became much worse, then that conflicts with the narrative that they're pushing globally about how China did everything they could and bought the world time, and the world should basically thank China, right? Because they're trying to have it in some ways, the domestic propaganda, international propaganda, they're trying to have it both ways.
Yeah. Which I feel like you can sort of get away with.
It depends. I think there's a chance they can get away with it, but I think it's harder now because there are enough people who are able to sort of understand and see the story that's being spun domestically, and compare and contrast that with the story that's being spun globally.
Okay.
And so it's harder, I think, than it used to be.
So let's talk a little more about Chinese overseas PR. I mean, we've just had, not in my short Chinese watching career have I seen CCP leaders start spreading conspiracy theories about America to the extent that we've seen with Zhao Lijian. So what's the motivation for having major foreign ministry spokesmen start talking about how America seeded the virus in China? And how do you think the dynamics have sort of played out since he started speaking the way he did over the past 2 weeks?
So I think he's certainly got a large audience inside China for what he's doing. The kind of the Wolf Warrior, that famous movie, sort of the Wolf Warrior diplomat approach, where he's very aggressively defending China and pushing it back against the evil foreigners. And I think that when you look at sort of what he's spinning up, it's not just him. He's been the most aggressive on Twitter and sort of overseas propaganda battle space. But in terms of inside China, there's an article last night from, I think it's China Radio International, or from the China Media Group, which is has CCTV, China Radio International, which basically it's like 3 questions for the U.S. and then the question number 2 is all about getting to whether or not this virus was actually created in the U.S. Army lab.
My Liaoning housewife Chinese tutor is convinced that America created it.
Right.
This is not just folks who are on Twitter.
No, and so this is another. So again, I think this goes back to sort of the domestic and the international dimensions of a sort of a propaganda message, which is so domestically. This is also, it's the sort of, okay, the local guys screwed up and they made it worse. It wasn't the center. Oh, and it was the Americans who made it, and so it was the Americans, and then the Americans are the most to blame, and then it's the local government, and then we in the center, Xi Jinping, we did whatever we could to fix it, right? And so there's that messaging that I think again helps to shift the potential blame or reclamations again away from Xi party center to the Americans, and then globally, I think China is extremely worried that they get blamed for this, right? Because it's wreaking havoc across the world, both physically and economically, and so for them to sort of seed this doubts and disinformation that maybe the U.S. did it's a way for them to, one, undercut the U.S. position in certain countries, but 2, create enough doubt and enough sort of noise that maybe they avoid what I think will be inevitable calls for accountability. And you saw, for example,
can you imagine lawsuits? Yeah.
Well, you saw, for example, the leader of Iran today, or last night or today, basically said he's been trading arms with Secretary Pompeo, and he said, suggested that it was a U.S. the virus was created by the U.S. Right? So it says, Khomeini said the United States could not be trusted to help because it, quote, may have created the coronavirus now sweeping the world. He's just spouting CCP propaganda.
Yeah.
What a surprise, right? But so that but that's part of. You got to remember that the Chinese Communist Party sees itself in a global information struggle with the U.S. especially, and I think this is the most aggressive it's become because the stakes are so high and everyone is under so much pressure.
Mm-hmm. How do you think the sort of soft power commercial diplomacy impact of these, Wuhan battle-scarred doctors being sent all around the world and Jack Ma filling up cargo planes with masks will play out.
So I think that's really positive, and I think that should be applauded. And I think that there are cases, it sounds like, where what's been said as aid is actually being charged for, which is unfortunate. But I think that the world needs masks. China produces most of the world's masks. China, if it is through the worst, or at least through the worst of the first wave, and so it can do a lot to help the world. And people should welcome Chinese, giving masks, giving other personal protective equipment, sharing experiences. The problem, and what's unfortunate, and I think back to this virus rumor, really is what's unfortunate is this could have been a moment where the U.S. and China could have actually worked together and could be more, I think, have a more positive approach to how to deal with this crisis globally. And yet, the way that China's been pushing this U.S. created the virus rumor has certainly, I think, turned a lot of people in D.C., made a lot of people in D.C. extremely angry, even people who weren't, convinced that necessarily China was an adversary. I think that it's really pushed things because again, people here are under so much pressure. It's made it very, very difficult for anyone to have any positive view of how the U.S. and China can work together. So, and the question too, I think,
Yeah, I'm not entirely sold on that, Bill. Just I think that the being able to pass the buck to China is such an easy rhetorical move that maybe there could have been better cooperation at the staff level or something than there is now. But it seems hard for me to see this president not going the sort of China virus route.
Yeah, I mean that's a fair point. I mean, and it is. I think at this point, I mean, we're beyond any hopes of really cooperating, and so now again, every leader has their domestic imperatives, and certainly for President Trump, blaming China for the virus is I think his political team sees that as a useful tool or useful pathway to the November election, because again, it's China's fault. China did it. This economic disaster, it's not our fault. People dying, it's not our fault. Blah blah blah. And so I just blame China, and it may work, right? But I guess the broader point is when I think you are going to see the Chinese government and maybe directly or using through, say, the Jack Ma Foundation. I think you're going to start seeing more donations to states and cities. I don't think you're going to see them donating to the U.S. government. But the other point I was going to make about China, and I think the sort of the Jian, the U.S. Army created the virus campaign, has hurt China, because this could be a moment where China gets a lot of soft power points, not just with sort of its traditional sort of smaller power friendly countries, but even in Europe, with bigger powers. And I think, though, that the way they've gone about prosecuting this disinformation campaign has actually pissed off a lot of people in other capitals as well. Part of the reason, obviously, that Jian, picked up and pushed on this sort of U.S. Army, maybe the U.S. Army created, was the claims coming out of D.C. from like Senator Cotton and like some other folks who were saying that, or hinted or kind of raised questions that perhaps this was not a natural virus, and perhaps it was created or escaped from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And the problem is we're in a cycle where the fact that China is now, and people like Jian and other official media are pushing so hard on this idea that maybe the U.S. created it, it's creating a dynamic where even people who were originally kind of skeptical about, is this virus not natural? I think you're going to start hearing more people say, well, what are the Chinese actually also pushing back so hard because they're trying to hide something? And so it's creating, and I have heard that from not Americans. So I think it's blowing up, it's backfiring on China in many countries, I think, not just in the US. And it's just unfortunate because the world doesn't need this right now. The world needs to figure out how to fight this virus.
Say you start the clock at February 5th or something. Like what the PRC was able to do to fight the virus is probably the most impressive accomplishment they have to brag about over the past, 20 years, aside from just like high growth. So for them to sort of throw this away to win brownie points in a sort of like tit for tat, stupid Twitter war with America is a real missed opportunity. I totally agree.
Yeah. I mean, I think, but again, we see it as a missed opportunity. I don't know. Maybe she and or they see this as look, America's weak, America's vulnerable. This is the time to kick America when it's down and gain some ground.
Yeah. Do you think Twitter, Facebook, YouTube should have played a bigger role in counteracting this propaganda push?
They talk about fighting coronavirus disinformation, but I guess a Daily Beast reporter got a hold of a Twitter spokesman yesterday. Twitter just pointed to their terms of service and said because Zhao Lijian's a public official, then he can say what he wants. I mean, the Twitter or Facebook. They're not just around China stuff, but around a lot of things. They're like. They're major platforms in a global information war, and they're like run by children.
So I'm writing a piece now about, who Cardi B is, Bill?
Yeah.
Your kids are the right age. Okay, so she put out this video, I guess a week ago now, talking about how like China's really got its shit together, and like America don't want no smoke with China because they're fast and they're quick and they're powerful. And basically, it was clear in the video that she'd watched this CGTN documentary about how like China was really handling the Wuhan virus well. So hats off to CGTN for getting Cardi B on their side in this global information struggle. It's a real, I think, testament to the fact that the quality of this international propaganda has really stepped up its game over the past few years
in certain areas. And then you have people like Zhao Lijian, who I think really it hasn't. I mean, there have been people who've tried to push Twitter to at least label an account from, say, Zhao Lijian or another PRC diplomat or Hu Xijin from the Global Times, basically say this account is for an employee of a government that blocks Twitter in their country or something like that. Even something simple, and they won't do that. They won't even. It's very strange. I mean, they're abdicating a lot of responsibility.
And the most ridiculous thing is like, Apple, you can sort of understand from a business rationale, right? They would lose, they would take a huge hit if the PRC started
more of their
to
business
their supply chain.
And a lot more of their supply chain. Yeah.
Yeah, but okay, like Twitter would lose some advertising dollars for some Chinese manufacturers trying to sell stuff in the US. It's a cheap stand to take.
No, it's just a fundamental management issue, and they've had a lot of management issues, not just related to China. I mean, it's kind of, I mean, it's what did Mark Zuckerberg? I mean, I think at one point he called it like a clown car that drove into a gold mine. I mean, anyway, this isn't a Twitter podcast, right? But Twitter has succeeded in spite of its management. Let's put it that way.
Sure. Mainland Taiwan relations. What has this crisis exemplified or taught you about the salient dynamics?
So that is very interesting because Taiwan, back to sort of China did a great job, and it's the Chinese authority, the system did it. Taiwan's done a really good job. And Taiwan also, I think one of the things we're learning as more information comes out is, Taiwan very quickly understood the risks of what was going on in Wuhan and the risks of the CCP system hiding information. And so they moved very quickly to start screening and then start blocking. And so they ended up, and they are a functioning democracy. They didn't need to resort to these draconian, brutal measures, and yet they've had a very small number of cases. They're obviously dealing now with a potential second wave from sort of people returning to Taiwan. But I think, and now you're learning too. I mean, one of the really real tragedies out of this, I think we're realizing, is just how the WHO, because it wouldn't deal with Taiwan because of the Beijing's policies, it's increasingly sounding like the WHO missed opportunities to get more information. I mean, the Financial Times yesterday had that piece, or on Sunday had that piece about how the Taiwan in early January tried to tell the WHO that this was human to human. There was human to human transmission before the Chinese would admit it, and before the WHO would say it. Well, there was, and if that information, and obviously the Taiwanese were correct, and if that information had been out there earlier. Again, this is one of those missteps inside China. If that information had been out there earlier and people had behaved differently, or Wuhan, they hadn't had many million people leave right before the Chinese New Year, again, it's probably would have been a much smaller outbreak. We won't know, but clearly that dynamic was very detrimental to the global fight against the virus.
Bill, does this dynamic get better with Xi still in power?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think that, one of the things that, when you asked about sort of what does this tell us about the CCP, Taiwan understands the CCP better than any of us.
Yeah.
And when they look at the last few years, especially under Xi, they look at what's been happening in Hong Kong, I think best case is status quo, but it's very hard to find anybody who's in favor of any sort of alleged one country, two systems or, reunification. And so if anything, the last few years, I mean, for sure the last few years has pushed Taiwan further away from Beijing's goal, not closer. And you just, I don't know how that dynamic changes while Xi and running China the way he's running it. It's kind of like, as people talk about things, I got four different subscribers over the weekend ping me to ask if I thought the rumors were true that China was gonna invade Taiwan because now was the moment, right? No, I mean, I think people are very concerned, right? That this is the rest of the world is distracted. The Chinese economy is not doing well. It's not going to do very well the rest of the year, and so you need a distraction. A, do you need distraction? B, there's no time like the present because who's going to intervene? Right. I mean, I don't think that's going to happen, but I think that there's certainly going around parts of Taiwan that's people are starting to worry about that.
Yeah. Well, that's horrifying.
No, it's completely horrifying, and I hope it's crazy wrong.
Let's talk about journalists in China. So what struck out to you about the whole series of events that led to the PRC's expulsion of some of the most beloved members of the press corps in China?
I mean, I was talking to someone from the New York Times today, and I mean, it's like they just devastated their operations there. It's so personally devastating, personally tragic for some of these people, but also just for cover. I mean, it's unfortunate. On the one hand, the way that the Chinese talk about reciprocity, but I mean, we got to understand it's fundamentally not reciprocal and hasn't been for years because CCTN, CCTV are not only doing news gathering here, they're broadcasting to U.S. audiences. You got China Daily, which is publishing in the U.S. and ironically, paying some of the papers whose correspondents were just kicked out to run their weekly insert.
Yeah. Is this going to stop finally?
Like, I mean, I just like, I'm still trying to figure out exactly how much these papers get paid, but you would think that after this, maybe they'd say, you know what, we don't want that. But again, the ad market sucks right now, so they'll probably take whatever money they can get. But then also, and so like People's Daily Overseas Edition is publishing here in Chinese. And so, fundamentally, last I checked, there aren't any U.S. media organizations publishing or broadcasting inside China to a Chinese audience. So this argument of sort of, the U.S. is being unfair and it's totally unbalanced, as I think you sort of heard from the foreign ministry spokesman more than once. That's just sophistry, to be honest, right? And so that said, in terms of reciprocity, I really don't think the U.S. could kick out another 50 Chinese journalists, and I don't think China actually cares, right? And there's certainly folks, just like what you see like a Zhao Lijian. The thing about Zhao Lijian and his wolf warrior diplomacy is he looks like it's the mainstream. He's not the aberration. And I think again, there's certainly folks in China, and maybe including Xi, who'd be more than happy to basically shut down most of these bureaus and kick all the U.S. journalists out. And so I think that, what's next, I mean, and it's tragic. And the Chinese were very smart in a very, very bad way in that they not only went after these really good reporters, they also went after the really good Chinese reporters, the quote unquote news assistants, the one who can't technically be reporters under Chinese law, but actually do a lot of reporting and really help shape and break a lot of news for all the news organizations in China. And taking out forcing some of those people to resign and removing some of the foreign correspondents, it effectively blinds some of these organizations in the near term. And maybe they can rebuild. It's going to take time to bring in new correspondents. We know how it takes a while for the pieces to be approved, and so we're going to see, I think, a significant degradation in U.S. Coverage of China from those affected media outlets for a while. And that's, what, again, maybe clearly there are some people in Beijing who think that's a good idea. I think it's unfortunate. I think though on the U.S. side, I don't think we're going to engage in a sort of a tit for tat. We're going to kick out another 50 journalists, but I do think that the U.S. government is going to be looking at other ways, maybe asymmetric to kicking out reporters to respond to the latest round.
So what's your favorite sort of like creative thing that, Treasury could do, Treasury or the State Department could do that is like asymmetric and out of the box?
Well, favorite is kind of the wrong term because I would just prefer that we're not in this tit for tat. I think that there's no.
Okay. Most clever.
So most clever. I mean, so I think that my understanding of what the Communist Party cares about. Again, it's not the reporters. It's about it goes back to the early discussions about sort of this global information struggle, and how the Chinese government is very focused on what they talk about, sort of the international discourse power, 国际话语权, right? And sort of they see it unbalanced globally, that the West has for far too long dominated global discourse, and China's a big country. We deserve more of that discourse power. And so a big part of that strategy is, the CCTN, China Daily, People's Daily Overseas. People's Daily Overseas is a little bit less. That's more targeted diaspora because it's in Chinese. But so measures that would target their ability to disseminate that information, say inside the U.S., would be much more meaningful and much more disliked inside China than kicking out more reporters. The thing is and this goes back to my comments about Twitter, Facebook, more about Twitter, but also Facebook, YouTube, is the key platforms in that globally are Twitter, Facebook, and Google. And so long as, and I don't think the US government can or has the ability to force Twitter, Facebook, YouTube to deplatform them. But, that is something where if the government were to pressure around the CCP medias using these American platforms that are global, but they are American companies, to sort of wage their struggle to increase their share of global discourse power, that would have, I think, a much more meaningful impact in Beijing than tossing a bunch of reporters.
Sure. How scared should the average freelance American journalist in China be right now?
I think every American in China should be a little bit nervous, just because of the way things are headed politically. I think we thought, it's been a rough couple years because of the trade war and stuff with Huawei, ZTE, and other things. It looked like with the phase one deal. I mean, you think about it, the phase one deal was what, 2 months and change ago, and it felt like the idea was, okay, it's not a great deal, but it puts a floor under the relationship. We're arresting, at least in the short term, we're arresting the downward trajectory of the relationship. And yes, we have all these other issues around security, technology, but this adds back some ballast to the relationship, and maybe it will slow the decoupling momentum. Maybe it will sort of slow the mutual invective and vitriol. And then, here we are, right? And so I think the trade deal may continue, and, Trump and Xi, I think, are going to have they may be doing something that sort of kind of, at least I think President Trump particularly cares about the trade deal still happening. But the pandemic now has unleashed a lot more forces on both sides that I think have not only restarted, but accelerated the trajectory towards decoupling on multiple levels. And as part of that decoupling, if that's really where we're headed, that makes it increasingly, I think, difficult to be an American in China over the medium to longer term. I really hope I'm wrong.
I'm just really jealous of everyone who got to live through better times, because it's really scary and it's not fun.
Are you going back?
I don't know.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a great answer. I had a great 10 years. The last time I was there was 2005 to 2015, and it was crazy. It was a fascinating time. And, one of the reasons I left in 2015 was I didn't like the trajectory, both in terms of the U.S.-China relationship, but also in terms of what was going on inside, the domestic political situation, specifically Xi Jinping. I think we were a little early, but I still don't see anything, if anything, that trajectory is worsened significantly. Yeah. And, there's just it's just, but it is unfortunate because we all of us who go spend time in China or go live there or go study there, we do it because for a reason. We actually want to like the country. We have Chinese friends. We actually want to have a positive U.S.-China relationship, and it's just so difficult to figure out how to do that right now.
All right, so let's do a little bit of happy stuff. Any China related Mandarin content worth binging on, reading to sort of distract ourselves from the, terrible situation that the world is currently in?
Chinese related worth binging on. The
So
last thing I watched was the 24 hours in Chang An, which was basically like a guy trying to, had 24 hours to prevent a big attack in Chang An. And it was interesting, but I don't
I
know.
thought it
I
was
mean,
beautiful.
it was
But it was
beautiful,
kind of
but
stupid.
it was, yeah. I got to like the 20th episode. I really liked the Yanxi Palace. That's the last one I like fully binged on. I actually really liked it.
Yeah.
Did you watch it?
I did. Again,
Okay.
I sort of dip in and out because my girlfriend, she watches it all in like 4 days. This is how she does these Chinese dramas. So
Yeah,
I'll
yeah.
see episode 4 and episode 9, and then I'll
Right,
like
right,
read
right,
some
right.
summaries in between.
And then the other one,
But
I don't know if she watched it, but I watched a bit with my mother-in-law. And it was actually pretty good. It's Da Jiang. Like I think it's in English. How is it translated?
it's
It's
Da
basically
Jiang
just about
Yeah.
it's an interesting story of like sort of the reform and opening era, right? I mean, obviously it's very a lot of the edges are removed, but it's an interesting story that I think shows in many ways the progress and the changes, and many of them very positive.
Yeah, it's I agree. I've actually really enjoyed that one too. It was, like when they try to make me cry, I just start laughing. But but aside from that, it was like they spoke really slowly. It was clear, like it wasn't too complicated, and it was like actually dealing with contemporary issues in a way that other modern shows don't. I've been watching Xiao, which is this sort of like Beijing rich families, kids are going through Gaokao, and like one of the kids just wants to be a race car driver, so he's not studying hard, and the other plays too many like video games on his phone, and it's just like so light and silly and ridiculous, which is, I guess, sort of fun escapism. But at least like Dada and Daha, you can think about it in the context of like, okay, this is propaganda, so like what is this trying to, like, how is the party trying to frame itself, and like what does that tell you about both the history as well as what like historical memory and whatnot, which is a more fun lens to look at things than really just seeing like this is just straight opiate for the masses,
Yeah,
and
I
there's
agree.
nothing behind it. So final question for you, Bill.
Mhm.
As Sinocism grow, you really have become this sort of agenda setter within DC for sure, as well as other capitals around the world. I'm curious sort of how you deal with that sense of responsibility, if you feel it or not, and what you think yourself as well as other journalists covering China have should be thinking about as we get into this really scary time.
No, I mean it's bigger than I ever expected to be, and it certainly has a readership that I don't think it's accurate to say agenda setting. I mean, but I think it's a data point or an information contribution to sort of how people look at China. But it's certainly for it's still small, but I mean I do have a lot of interesting readers, but I don't want to take credit or say I'm like setting a lot of agendas. But I think that I do feel more responsibility now, and that's why last week I think it was I sort of maybe sounded alarmist, but just looking at, for example, I obviously care a lot about the U.S.-China relationship. It's extremely distressing, right now to do the newsletter every day. Just not only because everyone's stressed because we're all basically locked down and what's going on around us, but then also layering on top of that, looking at U.S.-China relations and Zhao Lijian and all this stuff, and just like hair on fire every day because you just sort of say this is we gotta figure out how to get this relationship right, but it's really hard, and it's especially really hard because look, there's a lot of stuff going on in DC, but it's not fair to say the Trump guys are screwed it up. I mean, there's a lot of reasons that the U.S. policy is what it is because of what's coming out under Xi and from the Communist Party, and so it's just a very difficult time in the relationship. And so I think it's important to try and provide as accurate information as possible. And also, one of the things I struggle with is how to avoid the DC bubble. and it's easy to fall into that bubble here. A lot of it is just trying to spend as much time with sort of Chinese sources as possible. And it's harder and harder. I mean, the one thing that she's done, and it's not just for foreigners. I mean, the Xi era, you've seen a significant constriction of the information environment inside China. And the previous era, living in Beijing, I was in Beijing for 3 years of the Xi era, and 7 years of the Hu era, and there were actually people in Beijing who knew stuff, like real stuff, and you could talk to them, and you could actually people had an idea what was going on. Most Chinese people have no idea what's going on in terms of the politics, in terms of the policies, right? Forget the foreigners. There's just such a different environment and a different climate about how information is controlled and information is wielded under Xi. And then that it's even harder for foreigners. It's even harder, no longer living in Beijing. And so it's back to, I mean, last podcast you did with Ryan, you were talking about documents, and Ryan, he's masterful at reading documents. It does matter, that's one of the things that was part of my academic training, was looking at sort of party documents, and not at his level, but there are still ways to get some sense of what's going on. But the trick is not to just focus on the sort of the there's just a lot of echo chamber. Indeed, there's echo chambers everywhere, but trying to, and part of it is I'm somewhat reclusive these days, and so maybe I'm not on the circuit in DC, and maybe that helps a little bit.
Well, you're way out in Northeast, right? So I guess that's
Northwest, yeah, way out in North. But also and I guess now, like, being a recluse is a good thing, right?
All right, Bill, we should